Have you ever watched an entire courtroom rise? Not because a verdict was announced, but because someone finally realized who was standing in front of them? He walked in wearing a worn military coat, wrists cuffed, eyes downcast. Just another homeless man facing another charge. But when the judge glanced at the case file and read his name, her face froze. In that instant, everything changed. What followed wasn't outrage, but reverence. People didn't stand for the court. They stood for him, the man no one noticed, until the truth made it impossible to look away. New Orleans in December isn't kind to those without a door to close. The wind off the river bites through layers, even thicker ones like the frayed military coat Harold Briggs wore as he waited for his name to be called. Inside the courtroom, the heat worked just enough to take the edge off the cold, but not enough to make anyone comfortable. Harold, Hal, as the few who remembered him still called him, sat with his hands resting on his knees, fingers knotted and scarred from decades of labor. He was 72, black, and looked every bit of it. A grizzled beard crept down his face, his cheeks hollow, his frame thinned from years spent surviving rather than living. The coat he wore once bore honor. It had patches, insignia, things that meant something to someone once. Now it was mostly just fabric, keeping out the worst of the chill while telling a story few cared to hear. Hal had served as a sergeant in the U.S. Army, Panama first, then Iraq. He didn't talk much about the things he'd seen, the men he'd carried, or the ones he couldn't. He'd come home twice from war zones. The second time, he never fully made it back. When the jobs dried up and the medical bills stacked too high, Hal disappeared from the system's radar, slipping into a quiet kind of exile. For 9 years, he slept behind Café Louis, a corner bakery with good smells and better people. The cooks left food near the back vent sometimes. They didn't say much, just a nod here, a sandwich there. To Hal, that kindness was enough to call it the safest place he knew. But this winter brought a harsher cold than usual, and one evening, when the temperature dropped into the 20s, a young officer doing his rounds found Hal tucked behind the dumpster. "You can't sleep here," the cop barked. Hal didn't argue. He just asked if he could finish his sandwich. The cop didn't wait. He grabbed Hal's arm, twisted harder than needed, and hauled him up. That's how Harold Briggs ended up here. Docket 12F, City of New Orleans versus a man who once stood where few dared to, who'd once been saluted by men half his age and twice as frightened. Now the system called him a trespasser. No mention of his medals, no note of his service. Just a charge sheet and an empty chair. He didn't make a scene. Hal wasn't built that way. When the bailiff called his name, he stood slowly, joints stiff, back aching from cold nights and harder years. The courtroom didn't look at him. No one ever did. That's how it always went. Invisible until inconvenient. He shuffled forward, every step steady but worn, like an old machine that still worked but wasn't sure for how much longer. Behind the bench, Judge Lydia Renner shuffled some papers, not yet looking up. The public defender's seat beside Hal was empty. Hal didn't ask why. He'd learned not to expect much. The prosecutor, a young woman named Maya Richmond, flipped her file open and began reading charges as if listing off groceries. Trespassing, loitering with intent, resisting a lawful order. To her, it was another case in a busy morning. To Hal, it was the sum of his recent life. He didn't flinch, didn't blink, just stood there, hands together in front of him, waiting. When asked if he wanted to speak, he nodded and said quietly, "Just needed somewhere warm." No anger, no excuse, just the truth, spoken by a man who'd lost more than a night's sleep. Judge Renner finally looked up then. Her gaze landed on the man before her, on the coat, the posture, the name on the file. She paused for a moment, too long for routine. Somewhere deep in her memory, something stirred. But in the moment, she said nothing. The room returned to motion. The prosecutor recommended a 60-day exclusion zone downtown, essentially banning Hal from the few places left where he could eat or sleep. Hal nodded once, like a man who expected no better. Outside, the wind howled against the courthouse walls. Inside, a man who'd once fought for his country stood alone, judged by the very system that forgot his name. The courtroom carried on like any other morning, clipboards shuffling, murmurs bouncing off wood-paneled walls, and a clock ticking with mechanical indifference. Judge Lydia Renner glanced over her schedule, expecting another routine hearing. Case 12, F. Harold Briggs, trespassing. She adjusted her glasses and looked down at the man standing alone before her. Black, older, coat a little too big, posture humble but not broken. Across from him, Assistant District Attorney Maya Richmond began to read the charges, her tone clinical, practiced. Trespassing, loitering with intent, failure to comply. She didn't look at Hal, not really. To her, it was a familiar script. Just another line on the docket. Hal didn't flinch. The public defender's seat was empty. Nobody had told the court he wouldn't be there today, and nobody seemed particularly surprised. Judge Renner, sharp-eyed and mid-50s, paused. "Mr. Briggs, do you wish to represent yourself?" she asked, her voice firm but not unkind. Hal nodded once, calm and steady. "Yes, ma'am." A few heads in the gallery turned. He was polite, even formal, in a place where most folks fumbled their way through. Maya Richmond continued, laying out a case that sounded more like a pattern than a crime. "Mr. Briggs has had multiple citations across the last 3 months," she began. "He's a known figure near downtown food establishments. Several business owners have filed complaints." She thumbed through a stack of paperwork like it mattered more than the man standing in front of her. Hal spoke quietly, almost too softly for the room to hear. "I never stole, never begged. I sat, that's all." There was no defensiveness, no heat in his voice, just the plain truth. But the ADA pressed forward, recommending a 60-day exclusion zone from the downtown area. A line on a map that, if enforced, would cut Hal off from the 4th Street shelter and the handful of churches that still served hot meals on cold nights. Her logic was bureaucratic, wrapped in phrases like public interest and repeat offenses. Hal looked down for a moment before answering, his voice slow, deliberate. "That block's the only place that still remembers my name." The room quieted just for a moment. The gallery wasn't packed, but it held a few familiar faces. One man wore a Vietnam veteran's cap. Another sat with a service dog at his feet. Neither had spoken, but both now shifted in their seats. Ada Richmond sighed and glanced at the judge. "Mr. Briggs has had decades to put his life together. This city owes him nothing." It wasn't just the words, it was how she said them. Flat, dismissive, like she was talking about a pothole or a parking violation. That did it. A few murmurs broke the silence. Nothing disruptive, just enough to shift the air. The man with the dog narrowed his eyes. Another leaned forward, as if bracing for something. Hal didn't respond. He simply stood there, eyes steady but far away, like he'd heard worse in places much colder than this. On the bench, Judge Renner had begun flipping through the intake report, but something made her stop. She glanced toward her clerk, who was staring at the same document, eyebrows drawn tight. The young woman leaned over and whispered something, just one sentence. Then the clerk pointed to a specific line on the file, the name, the military ID number, the service history. That was when the judge's pen froze mid-signature. She blinked, then looked up at Hal again, this time really looking. Something in his bearing, something in the name, a flicker of memory, faint but insistent, knocked at the door of her mind. She glanced back at the intake sheet. Harold Briggs, Sergeant, Iraq, 2003, she murmured almost to herself. But she said nothing aloud. Not yet. The room moved on as if nothing had shifted, but something had. Hal hadn't raised his voice, hadn't asked for sympathy, hadn't leaned on his past. That was the thing. He didn't have to. The weight of what had been done to him and what was now being proposed, banishment effectively from the only place left that offered warmth or food, was enough to bend the room's spine, whether it knew it yet or not. Ada Richmond sat down, stacking her papers neatly, as if the case had already been decided. The judge leaned back slightly, eyes still on Hal, the silence between them thickening. There are moments in a courtroom when the law pauses. Not the process, not the clock, but the truth underneath it all. This was one of them. A reckoning was coming, but no one in the room quite knew why they felt it yet. Hal did not speak again. He'd said what needed saying. In just a few words, he laid bare the quiet injustice he lived through every day. He didn't ask to be seen. He didn't demand anything. But something in that quiet dignity cut, deeper than any outburst ever could. And across the room, in the heart of the judge, who had spent her career passing sentences without flinching, something had shifted. She stared at the man before her, a name echoing louder now than it had just moments before. Somewhere in her mind, a letter from 20 years ago resurfaced. A name her brother had mentioned. A man she never met but never forgot. The name was the same. So was the quiet. So was the strength. It couldn't be, but if it was, this wasn't just another case. It was a debt long overdue. The law would have to wait. Something else, older, deeper, heavier, was about to rise. And the room, still unaware, sat perched on the edge of something it didn't yet understand. The silence in the courtroom hung longer than it should have. Judge Lydia Renner stared at the intake file again, her finger resting on a name that triggered something too familiar to ignore. She looked up slowly, her voice more careful this time. "Mr. Briggs, were you stationed at Camp Caldwell in 2003? Hal's brow furrowed slightly. He nodded once. "Yes, ma'am, 3rd Battalion. Task Force Lion." His answer was simple, factual, but it shifted something in the air. Judge Renner blinked and leaned back in her chair, trying to steady herself against a sudden flood of memory. That unit, that year, that name. Without another word, she rose and recessed the court, retreating into chambers with a tightness in her chest that had nothing to do with procedure. Alone, she opened a drawer she hadn't touched in years. Inside was a worn scrapbook and an old letter, its envelope soft from time and folded at the corners. It was from her brother, Corporal Daniel Renner, sent months before he died in Mosul. She unfolded the letter and read it for the 100th time, but this time it burned differently. "If not for Briggs, I'd be ashes," it said. "Man's a ghost. Pulled me out of wreckage like it was nothing, then disappeared before I could thank him." She remembered Danny's handwriting, the ink smudged from the desert heat, his words describing a firefight, an ambush, and a soldier he called unshakable. She had spent years trying to track down that name after Danny's death, writing letters, filing requests, all of them hitting dead ends. And now he was standing in her courtroom, wearing a coat instead of a uniform, listed not as a hero, but as a defendant. The shock was sobering. When she returned to the bench, the tremor in her hand betrayed her otherwise composed face. She cleared her throat. "Mr. Briggs, please stand." Hal looked puzzled but did as asked. Slowly, methodically, the judge removed her robe and folded it neatly over the bench. The room stirred with confusion. "This man," she said, her voice steady but thick with emotion, "once saved my brother's life in Iraq." Gas rolled through the gallery like a wave. The ADA, frozen in her seat, couldn't process what was unfolding. The bailiff, himself a Navy veteran, instinctively raised his hand to his brow and saluted. From the back row, a man in an army cap stood up and spoke clearly. "That's Staff Sergeant Briggs. He was with me in Fallujah. Saved 6 of us that day." Hal stood motionless, eyes searching the judge's face, unsure if what he was hearing was real. Judge Renner took a breath and continued. "My brother, Corporal Daniel Renner, wrote home about you. Said you pulled him from wreckage after an IED hit their convoy. He said you vanished before he could say thank you. 2 months later, he was killed in another blast. But we had those extra weeks. Because of you." Her voice cracked, but she didn't falter. "I spent years trying to find you. The Army said you redeployed, that your file was sealed. And now, all this time later, you're here, in my courtroom. And I will not stand by while the system erases you." The ADA rose, flustered, trying to interject something about legal boundaries, but the words faltered in her mouth. The judge held up a hand. "The court recognizes Mr. Briggs's record of service, his sacrifice, and the circumstances of his arrest. All charges are hereby dismissed." The room remained quiet for a breath, and then one by one people began to stand. Not out of obligation, but out of reverence. A slow collective recognition filled the space. This wasn't just a man in need. This was a man the country forgot, a soldier left behind in more ways than one. No one said it aloud, But the message was clear. Hal Briggs deserved better. The gallery filled with civilians and veterans alike rising to their feet, some with tears in their eyes, others simply bowing their heads. One woman whispered, "That's what a real hero looks like." Hal, still stunned, lowered his head as if unsure he deserved the attention. But in the corner of the room, another veteran stepped forward, his voice full of certainty. "You carried us when no one else would. Let us carry you now." The ADA sat down slowly, her case file untouched, her face pale. No one looked at her. All eyes were on Hal. The judge stepped down from the bench and approached him directly. No titles now, no legal formality, just a woman who'd carried her brother's final words for decades, standing in front of the man who had made them possible. She reached out and placed her hand gently on his shoulder. "I thought you were a ghost," she said quietly. "Turns out, you were just never seen." Hal didn't speak. His throat was tight. For the first time in years, he was not invisible. He was remembered. He was seen. And more than anything, he was home. Later that afternoon, in a quiet side office away from the noise of the courtroom, Judge Lydia Renner asked Hal to sit down. There was no robe, no gavel, just two people facing each other without titles, without protocol. Sunlight streamed through the window, cutting across the dust in the air. Hal sat stiffly in a chair too small for his frame, his hands resting on his lap, still uncertain what to say after everything that had happened. Lydia handed him a glass of water and took the seat across from him. "I owe you more than an apology," she said, voice steady. "What you did for my brother, it gave my family time we would have never had. That matters. You matter." Hal looked away, quiet for a long moment. "I'm not a hero," he said finally. "I just did what we all did. Survive." She nodded slowly, eyes filled with something between admiration and grief. "He wrote that you were the best leader he ever had," she replied. "Said you never left anyone behind, even when it would have been easier." Hal didn't answer, but his jaw tightened just slightly, a crack in the armor of his humility. Lydia slid a folder across the desk. "My office has already contacted the VA. Your benefits will be fully reinstated. You'll get back pay, everything owed to you since your discharge. And I've spoken to a legal team I trust. They're going to handle everything. No more paperwork, no more red tape." Hal blinked, trying to process the weight of that sentence. "There's a housing unit already lined up," she continued. "Safe, permanent. And if you want help transitioning into something more, we'll be there. Not because you need rescuing, but because you earned better." Hal finally looked her in the eye. "Why now?" he asked. "Why me?" Lydia leaned forward, her voice lower now. "Because people like you never ask, and that's why you're forgotten. That ends today." In the days that followed, the ripples of the courtroom moment spread far beyond the city. News outlets picked up the story of the forgotten war hero finally honored. But Hal didn't chase the attention. He visited the shelter where he used to sleep, not to gloat but to thank the staff who had shown him quiet kindness when no one else did. He donated part of his back pay to help expand their winter program, funding more beds and more meals. A plaque appeared a week later on the building's front wall. "The Briggs Room, because every name matters." Judge Renner held a press conference on the courthouse steps. She didn't focus on Hal's charges or her personal connection. Instead, she spoke about the system, the way it failed those it was meant to protect. "This wasn't about leniency," she said. "It was about justice catching up to its own delay." She announced the launch of the Briggs Renner Veterans Initiative, a program designed to connect homeless veterans with legal aid, housing resources, and mental health support. "This isn't charity," she added. "It's repair." One face in the small crowd stood out, Assistant District Attorney Maya Richmond. After the conference, she approached Hal quietly. "I was wrong," she said plainly. "I made assumptions. I didn't ask the right questions. I'm sorry." Hal nodded once. "We all do what we think makes sense in the moment," he said. "But what matters is what we do after." Maya didn't ask for a second chance. She simply started showing up at the shelter every Wednesday evening, serving meals with the same hands that once flipped through legal briefs. Over time, people stopped recognizing her as a prosecutor. They saw her as someone showing up, again and again. No spotlight, no applause. Meanwhile, Hal began speaking at veteran support events, not as a guest of honor, but as a peer. He talked about pride, about silence, and about how dignity doesn't come from a uniform or a badge. It comes from showing up when no one's looking. He didn't try to be a symbol, he just tried to be useful. That was enough for him. The system that once ignored him didn't change overnight, but it started to. New policies were drafted, outreach improved. A new generation of attorneys, judges, and clerks read his story during orientation, not as folklore, but as a case study in what happens when institutions forget the people they're built to serve. One winter morning, as snow began to fall outside the city courthouse, Hal stood under a new bronze plaque installed by the front doors. It read, "Justice delayed is not always justice denied. Remember Sergeant Harold Briggs." He touched the corner of the plaque with his fingertips and smiled, not for himself, but for every name still waiting to be remembered. The video hit the internet like a spark in dry grass. Just under 2 minutes long, it showed a judge rising from her bench and removing her robe before saluting the homeless veteran standing before her. No music, no narration, just raw courtroom audio and a single caption at the bottom. When the system finally stood for the man it forgot. Within hours, it was everywhere. News anchors debated the moment. Veterans across the country filled the comment sections with their own stories. Moments when they felt invisible, unheard, discarded. Some wrote about sleeping in cars with service medals tucked under their seats. Others shared memories of friends who never made it home. The shelter where Hal once spent his nights saw a wave of donations. Someone started a hashtag, number signs stand for Hal, and it quickly spread across platforms. Schools began using the video in civics classes. A congressman reposted it with the words, "This is why we must do better." But Hal, true to form, didn't chase the noise. He remained grounded, preferring the quiet corners of the shelter where he now volunteered every morning. He helped clean trays, fold blankets, sit with those who hadn't spoken a word in days. He never brought up what happened in court. He didn't need to. If someone asked, he'd just smile and say, "Sometimes it takes the world a while to remember what matters." To those he mentored, he wasn't a headline or a hashtag. He was the man who listened when no one else did. The man who showed up with warm coffee and sat beside you without judgment. He was what dignity looks like when it walks without needing attention. The judge's courtroom never quite returned to normal. Her ruling became a precedent, and her voice, once known for being precise, was now recognized for being personal. Every new case felt a little heavier, a little more human. It wasn't about leniency, it was about seeing people clearly. That's what Hal taught the city, not with speeches or lawsuits, but by standing quietly until someone finally stood with him. If this story moved you, even for a moment, share it. Share it with someone who feels unseen. Share it with someone who gave more than they ever received. Let someone out there know their name still matters. And if you believe stories like this can help rebuild what systems sometimes break, subscribe to our channel. We share real stories. Stories where dignity rises, justice speaks, and heroes come home.